Hey guys, welcome back. It's Toby Vance, Lost History of Eden. Our video today is going to be looking at the idea of, do we have any kind of evidence for a divine being, a higher consciousness, a God, in some way communicating with humanity? Okay, if you haven't already, go check out our video on Does God Exist? Because that kind of lays a little groundwork for this video here. Obviously, if we've got some evidence for God in some way communicating with humanity, that would also, by default, kind of be evidence that a God exists. But we also established with another argument some pretty solid reasons why the idea of God isn't improbable. That's what we do in the first video, the one on Does God Exist? And obviously arguing, 100% that there's a God, and we can know that with certitude is pretty much impossible. But at the very least, what we can do and what we try to do, and what I try to do in the first video, Does God Exist?, is to just show that it's not improbable. It's not a crazy, loony idea to believe in God, as it's sometimes put forward by skeptics and people that you see on the internet and social media who talk about your sky fairy and your sky daddy and all of this kind of stuff, and mock the idea like it's just completely foolish and nonsensical to believe in a divine being or a God or a higher consciousness. It's not. It actually, if we consider some propositions as we do in the Does God Exist video, those propositions can lead us to the idea that it's probably not unlikely that there is a God. So here we're going to look at if there is a God, okay, and the idea is not that crazy that there is, but if there is a God, is there any way we can determine whether that God has in some way communicated with us? Okay, so that's what we're looking at in today's video. Evidence that goes along with that, and pretty much what we're going to be doing is looking at evidence from the Tanakh, okay, the Jewish Bible. As I've stated before, I'm Jewish, so obviously I think there's a lot of indications, obviously, that Judaism is valid, and that in times past, God has spoken to the Jewish people. I think that's pretty evident in the Jewish Bible and the Tanakh. And so that's what we're looking at in this video. We're looking at evidence from the Tanakh that the God of the universe did communicate with the Jewish people. And I think there's some pretty rock solid evidence. Again, you'll see scoffers, skeptics online who mock the Bible and don't take it seriously. And as I've talked about, as I've said before, if you haven't already, check out our video, our introductory video, considerations, which just gives some considerations of things we need to think about before we start getting into discussions of the Bible and science and archaeology. And in that video, I talk about, we basically have two extremes. We've got the extremes of, we got one extreme of the Bible literalist, the fundamentalists, those who take the Bible literally and everything it says, throw science completely out the window, and sort of create their own science that fits with the Bible. That's an extreme. That's we don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. And that's obviously not my approach. As you've seen, if you've watched my videos, I have a series on why evolution is true. We know evolution to be a fact. And so we've got very solid evidence that evolution's a fact and why the earth is 4.5 billion years old, things that biblical literalists reject. So I don't like to take that approach. I think that's an extreme, but the other extreme obviously is the extreme of discounting the Bible completely. That is just a book of fables. It's just made up by humans. Some Bronze Age goat herders just, you know, pulled this out of their rear end, basically. So um, that is an extreme also. And I think that idea is one that there's very solid evidence that goes against that idea and that extreme. And so we're trying to find that middle ground. And so I did my series of videos sort of striking at the biblical literalists and showing how we have some good science on evolution, we have some good science on the age of the earth. Now I'm looking at the other extreme, those who totally reject God, reject the Bible. And so we're sort of establishing some groundwork in that area that there is a God, that the Bible does have some things in it which seem to indicate that it has a divine source to it. And so that's what we're doing in this series of videos I'm doing now. And this is the second one on our religious aspect, the aspect of why the Bible can be trustworthy. Because once we establish that, then we can start looking at how it fits in with history and science and archaeology. Because if you think the Bible is nonsense, you're not even going to consider it. It's just, why even look at it? So that's what we're trying to do here. So let's go ahead and jump into it. We're going to be looking at evidence in the Tanakh that give us a very clear indication that God has communicated with humankind. Okay, so today we're talking about, has God revealed himself to mankind? If there was a way that we could determine it, what would be something we could maybe look to for evidence that a divine being has communicated with humans? That's the question we're going to be focusing on today. So what would that evidence look like? That's our first question. What kind of evidence would be a good indicator that a God had communicated with humans? Well, a very good evidence would be if a God provided an extremely detailed narrative of a nation's history right at their beginning, just as they were brand new, just formed, brand new nation in sort of a tribal form still, and laid out what their history was going to look like over the next few millennia. That would be a pretty good evidence. And if that narrative then played out exactly as it was detailed by God, then that'd be pretty good proof that it was probably a God that told him that. What we're going to see is that's exactly the evidence we have in the Tanakh that describes the history of the Jewish people. So let's look at some of those verses that describe this history and look and see how they compare to what we see in Jewish history. So the Tanakh has this prophecy which gives us a very detailed description of how Jewish history will play out. And some of those have only come true within the lifetime of people that are alive today. So all of these things were written down roughly 3,000 years ago, depending on what time frame you give for the writing of the Tanakh and when it was compiled together and such. We're looking at roughly about 3,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, as to when these words would have been written. Regardless, many of those things don't take place until centuries after. So this is giving an overview of history all the way up until times that we're living in today. So let's uh, let's look at what this looks like as it plays out. We're going to be focusing mostly on chapters 28 through 30 of the book of Deuteronomy and Amos 9:15, which is a book of prophecy, uh, which lay out a detailed description of the Jewish people's future history. And I've broken these prophecies into 9 components. Essentially, there's 9 characteristics that are given in these verses about what Jewish history is going to look like. And so we're going to look at those 9 characteristics. But let's consider the 2 options we have about this before we start looking at them. Because really, there's only 2 options. If you're coming at this from a skeptical viewpoint, you don't believe the Bible, the Tanakh, has anything to do with a God. It's just something that was generated by people, by Bronze Age goat herders, which is the term we hear from skeptics many times in kind of a mocking way to describe the people that wrote the Bible. We have these Bronze Age goat herders, and they just wrote this stuff and they made it up. That's really our first viewpoint. So when we look at these characteristics of what this history of the Jewish people is going to look like, it would be something that is just an entirely random guess by the writers of Deuteronomy and Amos about what the future of their people look like. They were in no way in contact with any kind of God. They just randomly pulled this out of their head and just wrote it on paper, all of these characteristics about what their future history would look like. That's our first option. That would be the option you would take if you are a skeptic and you don't believe the Tanakh was given by God. The second option is it was revealed by some form of higher intelligence, a higher intelligent consciousness that we would call God, a divine being that has the ability to see the entire course of history, that has the ability, being and existing outside of time, to see all of time and history as it takes place. So let's look at these 9 characteristics, and we're going to look at them straight from the verses quoted directly out of Deuteronomy and Amos. And the verses that we use here are going to be taken from what we call the New International Translation of the Bible. First one, Deuteronomy 28:64. It says, "And the Lord will scatter you among all nations from one end of the earth to the other." And to think about the context of this, this is where God was talking to Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. He had given the Torah to the people of Israel, and he's describing to Moses and the people of Israel the things that are going to take place if they don't follow the Torah. So that's what's being detailed here in these passages in Deuteronomy. So he says, you're going to be scattered among all the nations from one end of the earth to the other. Okay. These aren't metaphorical. These aren't allegorical. They're straight up just saying what's going to happen. He says, among those nations, you won't find any repose. You won't find any resting place for the sole of your foot. Third characteristic, he says, you're going to go to these places and you're going to have an anxious mind. Your eyes are going to be weary with longing, and you're going to have a despairing heart. And the reason for that is the next one, which is they're going to live in constant suspense, filled with dread both night and day, never sure of their life. So they're going to wander from place to place, and everywhere they go, it is going to be dangerous. Their lives are going to be in danger in all the places that they move to. He says, there you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. Okay, again, just showing this idea that they're going to be scattered throughout the entire globe, and they're going to go from place to place, and they're going to be hated everywhere they go, and they're going to be reviled, and their lives are going to be in danger, and they're never going to find any rest in any one location. Number 6, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you. So first there's a scattering. They're scattered all over the world. They go from place to place. They wander the entire globe and they never find rest in any one place. But then he turns around and says, I'm going to bring you back out of all of those nations. I'm going to gather you from them. Even if you've been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He says, no matter how far you are driven to on the planet, you will be brought back from that location, back to the land that he gave them in Israel. He says he will bring you to the land that belonged to your ancestors, that being the land of Canaan, as it's called in the Tanakh before they take possession of it, the land of Israel after they take possession of it. Um, that same land, he says, that belonged to your ancestors, meaning the people that are writing this at this point in time, because this is a future time. This is referring to way in the future when the people who are listening to God say this now and who are writing this down, they are the ancestors that he's talking about here. It's the place they're going to live when they go into the land of Canaan and take it and it becomes Israel. He also says once he does that, he's going to make them more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors ever were. And then the last one, this is the one that comes out of Amos. He says, I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given them. So he says, this time you're going to be settled into this land. You're not ever going to be kicked out of it ever again. It's going to be yours from that point onward. Okay. Okay, so let's look at each of these characteristics and do an examination and a comparison of them with what we see in Jewish history. So the first one, the Lord will scatter you among all nations from one end of the earth to the other. Okay. If there's any characteristic of Jewish history that most people are familiar with, it is this characteristic here. This is what we call the diaspora, okay, which is the scattering of the Jewish people throughout the world, and they're wandering throughout the world. It initially began with the Assyrian captivity to the northern kingdom of Israel, where the 10 tribes in that part of Israel are taken off into captivity. They never return. Uh, Later, we have the Babylonian invasion of the southern kingdom. They take the southern kingdom into captivity, but ultimately return them, and they stay in the land for a period of time after that, until we reach the time of the Roman Empire. And then in 70 CE, which is the ultimate point when the diaspora really begins, the Romans move into Judea and Jerusalem. They destroy them, level them. Uh, they kill many of the Jewish people. Those that don't get killed flee. And at that point, they essentially flee in every direction. There are Jews that go south, southwest into Arabia and Africa. There are Jews that go east into the Middle East and into Asia. There are Jews that go north and northwest into Europe and into uh, the area of Russia, uh, and and then ultimately, as we move even further into history and into the modern era, uh, over into the Americas. And so this is the start of the ultimate diaspora where the Jewish people now move into essentially every part of the globe for the next couple of millennia. Now, he says, among those nations you'll find no repose, no resting place for the sole of your foot. That history of the diaspora has been nothing more than the Jewish people wandering from country to country, from nation to nation. Uh, and everywhere they go, ultimately, they're forced to leave either by being kicked out of the country or just being persecuted to a point where they have to flee. Just some of the more important expulsions of history. The initial one from the Romans that starts the diaspora, the expulsion from Judea in 73 CE. Then we have the expulsion and destruction of Jewish communities throughout Europe and the Middle East during the 3 centuries of the Crusades. We have the expulsion of Jews from England in 1290 CE. In that expulsion, they are kicked out of England for roughly about 3 centuries before they're allowed back in. You have the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492 as a result of the Spanish Inquisition, also the same year that Columbus set sail to the Americas. This is one that many people aren't familiar with. I threw it in just to show that even here in the United States, there were some expulsions of Jews from the states of Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky. This occurred by General U.S. Grant during the middle of the Civil War when Grant took Vicksburg, Mississippi. Uh, he issued an order to expel Jews from these 3 states because he felt that Jews were supporting the Confederates in their efforts. The Russian pogroms in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Um, Many Jews were killed, and ultimately, many of them fled from Russia as a result of this. And then you have the Holocaust, obviously, in the 1930s and 40s. So you can see there's really been nowhere that the Jewish people have been able to go where they were fully welcome. They've always been uh, persecuted, oppressed, resisted, pretty much in every nation they've gone to, with a few minor exceptions. He says, there the Lord will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart. These all kind of just go together here. They'll live in constant suspense, filled with dread both night and day, never sure of their lives. There you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. This is just a verse that's kind of alluding to the idea that Jews will not even be wanted for their labor. They'll be so reviled that many of these nations will just literally want to kill them and slaughter them, not even keep them as slaves to use for labor. So, again, everywhere they go, it's clear. Again, this language is precise. This is not metaphorical. Uh, there's no prophetic and visionary sort of allegory or apocalyptic style language. There's no metaphorical types of language here. This is just straight up exactly what's going to happen in very clear and plain language. No ambiguity. And we've seen, as we know, as anyone who is familiar with Jewish history knows, this is exactly a perfect description of what Jewish history has looked like, and the fear and the dread and the constant fear of their lives and the places that they've gone and the things that they've seen and the things that they've been subjected to. There are multiple historical events we know where they went through just this kind of persecution, this kind of fear, and this kind of lifestyle of just being afraid everywhere they went. The Crusades, uh, multiple Jews were slaughtered through the Crusades in multiple European countries and Middle Eastern countries. The Inquisition, uh, when the church essentially forced Jews to either convert or to die or to flee. The Russian pogroms under the Tsar, and then later on, even under Stalin, when again millions of Russians were killed, put to death. And then obviously the Holocaust under the Nazis, where Jews were just shipped off to death camps and just slaughtered by the millions over the course of a few years. Um, this description couldn't be any clearer and more accurate in what the history of the Jewish people looked like. We can see it just from the Holocaust itself and many of the visuals that we have from the Holocaust. Famous photos that we see, the looks on their faces, the fear. This was the type of lifestyle that Jews lived everywhere they went. Uh, Hated, being put to death, uh, constant anxiety, a life of just persecution and oppression everywhere they go, being reviled, being mocked. Okay, these images convey exactly what these verses in Deuteronomy are saying. Then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you. Now, this verse, we don't see the fulfillment of this until we get into the modern era. And the groundwork for this begins to be laid in 1917 with the League of Nations adopts the Balfour Declaration, and that paves the way for the Jewish people to begin migrating to Palestine, back to the land that they once lived in, Israel. And then he says, if you've been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there God will gather you. He's going to bring you back to this land. And that culminates ultimately in 1948 when the Jewish people, through a vote of the UN nations, are given sovereignty and made a nation and a country once again after 2,000 years of wandering the entire globe, going from country to country and being persecuted everywhere they went. The state of Israel is born. We know the U.S. played a pivotal role in helping that to come to be, giving support in the UN for Israel and helping to get the vote that was needed for that. U.S. was one of the first to recognize the state of Israel in 1948. And in 1948, again, a time when people today uh, that are alive who witnessed this event happen is an event that we see was written down by Jewish writers almost 3,000 years ago. And he says, I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land that I have given them. That's the quote from Amos. This is the only prophecy of the 9 characteristics that we look at here that has not yet happened. The reason it hasn't yet happened is because we have no way of knowing if they're going to be uprooted from the land. So we obviously can't say that this one's been fulfilled, because at any point they could obviously be destroyed or driven out of the land of Israel. But given the accuracy of the first eight characteristics, I think it's a very good probability that we could go with that this one also will come true, just as the first eight did. And if it does come true, it has a lot to say about the nation of Israel today and the ability of anyone to drive them out and defeat them in any kind of war, which, according to this, will not ever happen. So it should give consideration about the future of the nation of Israel, especially for those who don't like Israel and want to see Israel destroyed. Uh, Considering the success of the first eight characteristics and verses, prophecies that we saw, and the fact that they came true literally to the letter, um, it's probably a good bet that this one here will also uh, be true and will occur. So let's consider, okay, remember our two options, okay? Either this was just some random Jewish writers uh, in the time of the Bronze Age, 3,000 years ago, who just randomly made up some characteristics about what the future of Israel was going to look like, the future of the Jewish people, and just wrote them down. Okay. Let's consider it from that option and then pose some questions and think about what the likelihood of that is. How likely is it that a Bronze Age goat herding tribe would endure through history's greatest empires, maintaining its culture, language, and religion as it was back then, exactly the same today, to become a modern nation? What other nation do we have uh, today on the globe that fits that description? There is only one, and it is the nation of Israel. There's no other nation that endured throughout millennia, maintaining the same culture, language, and religion, after being scattered throughout the entire world and coming back to settle with that original language, culture, and religion back into the same land again. That's not happened. What other Bronze Age tribal people have accomplished such a feat? Second question, how likely is it that a Bronze Age tribal people would be targeted specifically for elimination and destruction by virtually every major empire in history and survive every single one of these attempts by these empires to wipe them out? Empires that were vastly more powerful than them and should have had no problems in destroying the Jewish people if they had wanted to. And they did want to. We know from history that every empire, every major empire from that time period, went against the nation of Israel and attempted to drive them out, take them into captivity, wipe them out, assimilate them. And as we know, every single one of those failed. Not a one of them were successful. What are the odds? What are the odds of that happening? How likely is that? Let's look at some of these. These are the empires that went against the Jews: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, Spain, England, Russia, and ultimately the Nazi Third Reich. Every single one of these threw themselves onto the Jewish people to destroy them and were broken against them. Then this question, how likely is it that a Bronze Age tribal people, after being dispersed among multiple nations throughout the globe, would not be assimilated and ultimately return to the land that they once occupied in the Bronze and Iron Ages? How likely is that? Assimilation is the typical outcome in sociocultural evolution when smaller cultures become dominated by larger ones. It happens all the time in pretty much every tribal group from that time period. This happened to, and they all vanished. We no longer have Hittites. We no longer have Canaanites. We no longer have a multitude of tribal peoples, Celts, and so on, who vanished because they ultimately were assimilated by the larger cultures. Uh, Not only did that not happen with the Jewish people, but it didn't happen as they went from country to country, various geographical locations through various time periods over centuries and millennia. They were able to resist this every single time and maintain a unique characteristic and nationhood that ultimately was able to be reestablished once again in our modern time. And then finally, how likely is it that a Bronze Age tribal people had all of these things happen to them after they predicted in their holy scriptures that these things would happen? And then those things occurred precisely the way they said they would. What's the likelihood of that? How can any skeptic look at this? In fact, I've heard people say if a God wanted to reveal himself, all he would have had to done was write down in 2500 BC that there'd one day be a 747. Okay, I've heard people use that kind of argument to say that would be an easy way. This is, in essence, that. This gives an exact history of a people and what it would look like, and it followed through exactly as it was described, and it occurred exactly as it was described. Um, we were told 3,000 years ago this is what the history of this people is going to look like in specific detail, without allegorical language, without metaphorical language, but in clear, unambiguous language. These aren't vague allegorical prophecies like Nostradamus with stars will fall from the sky and a rock will burn and things like that. Everyone knows the quatrains of Nostradamus and how they're very vague and they can be interpreted in multiple different ways. That's not what this is. This is specific. This is what's going to happen with a clear, detailed description in clear language of exactly how this is going to play out. Specific, unambiguous, uh, no confusion as to what is going to occur and how it's going to occur. Okay, the fact that these were fulfilled in every precise detail is highly improbable. It's highly improbable if one, the writer just randomly made them up and put them in the Bible, and two, if historical events themselves were just merely random and not driven by some higher purpose. If either of those two things are true, there's no way this would have occurred. The statistical probability of this is beyond comprehension. It's at the level of what we would call impossible. Mark Twain had a famous essay in which he pondered this about the Jewish people, this aspect of their history, and how just completely out of the norm that it is. And he said, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1/4 of 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous puff of stardust lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of. has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world's list of great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also very out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all ages and has done it with his hands tied behind him. He could be vain of himself and be excused for it. The Egyptians, Babylonians, and the Persians rose, filled the planet with sound and splendor, then faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greeks and Romans followed and made a vast noise, and they were gone. Other people have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in twilight now and have vanished. The Jew saw them all, survived them all, and is now what he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his part, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert but aggressive mind. All things are mortal but the Jews. All other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality? The conclusion, the only conclusion we can come to, is that this unique, unparalleled history of the Jewish people, coupled with the fact that they predicted this unique history at their very beginning when they were first starting out in precise detail before it ever even happened, gives probably the most conclusive evidence on the planet that there is a higher being, an intelligent being, a conscious being um, that the Jewish people claim to be in communication with, and that that person and that divine being is real. That is the only conclusion that can be uh, brought about from examining this entire history of the Jewish people and their prediction of it. So it's an obvious conclusion based on the 9 characteristics that we see of Jewish history, those prophecies in the Bible, which 8 of have clearly come to pass. Any cursory glance at history confirms that those 8 have taken place and taken place exactly as they were recorded in the Bible. The 9th one obviously hasn't, but as I said, considering that the first 8 have come to pass, we have a probably pretty good certainty that the 9th one will too. Just consideration for those who think they are going to go up against the nation of Israel and possibly drive them out of that area. May want to reconsider that in light of those first 8 prophecies, which came true exactly as they were stated. Okay, so this is a really good evidence, I think, and gives pretty, I think, conclusive facts that God in some way communicated with those who were writing the Bible. Okay. Make sure you continue following us. Hit the like button on the video there. Make sure you subscribe and share our videos as much as you possibly can. We got more stuff coming here in the next few weeks. So hang on and stay tuned. Thanks a lot.